Hello, I'm Josh Baer, and welcome to the Baer Faxt podcast. In this episode, we talk about art, cars, artist cars, and a whole lot more with Shelby Myers from the leading car collecting auction house, RM Sotheby's. We'd like to welcome our audience to this episode of the Baer Faxt podcast. This week, we're joined by the global head of private sales, that's a mouthful, Shelby Myers from RM Sotheby's now. Welcome to the podcast, Shelby.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
It's
great to be here.
You're another second generation person, my mother being an artist, growing up in the art world, you being a car person growing up in a company that your dad founded over 35 years ago. We can sort of relate to art and cars as being part of our lives, our whole lives, right?
Yeah, I had no choice but to be in the car business. My dad started the business 45 years ago, actually, out of his parents' garage. He dropped out of high school in grade 10 and he founded the business. And, over time, we grew it into a restoration company. And then when I was a kid, I used to go with my father to auctions all across the country and around the world. And we used to consign cars to auctions. And I think one day he woke up and thought, this auction thing is pretty familiar. I could probably do this myself. So he started his own auction company in Toronto, Canada. And it kind of just grew from there. And in the mid-90s, we had a group of investors come in and gave us some seed capital to really expand the business. And it sort of took off from there. And we built the world's largest auction house for collector cars. And since then, we've expanded it into other areas, including private sales, financial services, and some digital businesses. So yeah, it's been an incredible, incredible journey.
I want to launch into the most interesting part for me, in a sense, is like, what would you like art collectors to know about what's going on in the collector car category? What wouldn't we know that we should know? What would surprise us?
First of all, I think cars are a natural part of our lives. They really represent mobility in a sense. And so everybody has a car. Probably everybody of my generation and older certainly would remember their first car, the first time they got their driver's license. I know a lot of younger people probably aren't even getting their driver's license now, but certainly cars have been ingrained in our society for the last century in a really meaningful way. And they represent a lot of different things. They're really a fusion between design and technology and materials and history, sort of almost artistry in terms of what the designers at the times were thinking. And when you look at a car of a certain period, it harkens back to, what was going on in that period. In the 50s, you had these Cadillacs with these giant fins, and you could tell that there was a lot of positive things going on in society then because the colors were interesting. And, and if you date back even 10 years prior to that 50s generation, during the 40s, cars were very mundane and they were very pedestrian looking. There wasn't a use of great colors or great style, and car design didn't really evolve for a decade or so. And so it's really interesting when you look at automobiles and what they represent in our society, because you can sort of dissect what was going on during that time and what designers and artists at the time were thinking when they designed and styled a car. So to me, that's the really interesting thing about automobiles is that, it's really this fusion of all these different artists really coming together to making sort of one masterpiece. And so that's what I really think is interesting. And I think in a way, there's a high level of sophistication around the automobile, and particularly really important automobiles. And I think that sometimes cars have gotten a bad rap because, the term gearhead and the term, it's a bit more of a degrading term in the way that cars are looked at. And I think only now they're starting to be recognized as really sort of sophisticated objects that really represent a lot of different things that make them really appealing and really interesting.
Well, the one thing you said is interesting to me. It almost sounds like you relate to your car like music. Music is like, I heard that song when I was breaking up with my girlfriend, or those kinds of things put you in a time and place. I don't know that art objects work that way in general. I don't think we really have that exact nostalgia for them. I don't know if you disagree on that.
Yeah, I think cars are really a holistic experience. I am a passionate art collector as well. I have a number of very decent contemporary pieces, and my mother was an artist growing up. So I definitely have an artistic interest that runs through my family and runs through my veins. But cars bring this whole experiential element that you don't really get that in other collecting genres, And so when you first get your license and you take your girlfriend or, your partner out on a date in your first car, and you have these conversations, you can kind of remember what the smell was like and where you parked and what that experience is like when you're in a car and you drive a car and you experience a car. I just finished a 1,000-mile road rally in Colorado with 5 or 6 really good friends, and there was 120 cars on this rally. And, we're driving thousands of miles through the mountains, and there's this visceral element to cars, and we're getting in a 1929 blower Bentley, which is open, and you feel the cold air, and a non-synchro mesh transmission, which requires quite a bit of skill to shift the car, and you're in the elements. And then you get into a 1960 Ferrari 250 short wheelbase. And then we flew back to LA, and I jumped in a new roof CTR Anniversary with 750 horsepower, fully carbon tub, fully carbon body. And it's this sort of heart pounding experience that is just a visceral mind game. And you just look at those three different genres of cars from the 1920s to the 1960s to modern day, and the experiences that they bring you is something that you don't get in other collecting categories like watches or artwork. You're not in and you're not experiencing an automobile. And to me, the sound, the smell, just the adrenaline that you get from driving some of these cars is just an incredible experience, and one that I never found in any other space.
Back to your art collecting, do you remember your first work that you bought with the same sort of nostalgic thing?
Well, my first purchase or my first artwork was my mother's. So she was a pretty serious painter. She never made it big. She had her own studio, and I worked with her when I was a kid in the studio. She was a sculptor. She did bronzes. She did some raku pottery. She did oil and canvas. Her pencil and paper was incredible. Her level of detail was amazing. So I really grew up in two worlds. One was the car space and the other was the art space. And so we always had, the contemporary art books on our kitchen table. And we always had, Art News magazine that would come to our house every month. And so I would always pick up art magazines and car magazines. And so it's this shared passion of mine. And so my first work wasn't a significant work. It was actually a Geo Ham, which is a more of an automotive related artist. When my dad dropped out of high school, he started to paint and weld motorcycles. And so we grew up around motorcycles. And I found beauty in some of the early turn of the century Indian and Harley board track racers. And Geo Ham did this really cool painting. It's a bit of a stylistic interpretation of a board track racer in 1911. And I bought it at a car auction. I thought it was just the most beautiful thing. And then that led to me moving to Italy. And I spent 3 years working at Ferrari around some of the designers and some of the artists that build the cars, especially Formula One. And then I spent 7 years in London. And every year in London, I'd go to the Sotheby's, the contemporary sales on Bond Street, and kind of dabbled in some bidding and stuff like that. And I ended up buying a Peter Doig. And I always loved Peter Doig because he was really harking back to my sort of experiences as a kid growing up in Canada. And Peter painted a lot of really great Canadian landscapes and winterscapes. And to me, he was a painter's painter. And I thought he was a really beautiful artist. And I thought he was really talented in what he did. And so I bought a piece that reminded me of fishing when I was a kid. So I used to fish in our pond. I grew up in a 40-acre forest property. And so I purchased this work, and it was a piece called Night Fishing. And it was a Peter Doig work on oil and canvas. And it looked like a young boy in the painting. And he appeared to be fishing into the wee hours of the evening. And it reminded me of when I was a kid, and I used to go back to the pond that we had in our back forest, and I would sit on our dock and I would fish. And my mom would have to ring the dinner bell and bring me in to eat because I just wanted to stay out fishing. And so I bought this Peter Doig, and I don't think he was a really well-known artist at the time, or he was just up and coming, but I loved his artwork. And, I still have that piece today. It's on my wall right in my office. And it's just a piece that I've just loved and I fell in love with, and I'll probably have for the rest of my life. So that's one of the pieces that I bought. And then I ended up buying a couple other Peter Doigs as well. And I got into collecting Rauschenberg and Damien Hirst, and my interest have maybe moved into more contemporary, like I've always thought of Basquiat. I bid on a Basquiat in early days. I bought a Banksy, and I love the diversity of various artists and artwork in different eras.
Well,
So,
beyond the personal, in the way that you're running a major business that did, I know, $165 million auction a few weeks ago, not so much you personally, but your car collector, your clients, what should we as the art world be explaining to them that they don't know about us? And again, sort of what should we be understanding about them? And then I'll connect the two in a minute.
well, I think that cars, if you look at car collecting, it's really in its infancy stages. Sotheby's is a 300 plus year old company, and We've been around for 40 years and we're really one of the mainstay companies in the space. And, the advent of car collecting really started in the 1950s with, guys like Henry Austin Clark that started to buy early American sort of Vanderbilt Cup cars and various other things. And so it really is in its infancy stages. And so we've only been probably through one or two cycles. And I think that car collecting has a lot of room to go. I mean, the automobile, as I mentioned earlier, is such an important part of our lives and represents this freedom and this mobility and this thing that we just remember, and everybody can remember cars. And I think that, as cars sort of get into more of a maturity stage, I think they're looked at by collectors as more serious collector pieces that both represent value appreciation and also represent a form of utility and community. So as I mentioned, this rally that we did in Colorado, we had 5 or 6 close friends of mine, and we would share time in cars together. And our conversations would lead to all sorts of different subjects and different topics. And you really built this friendship, and it was all through cars. And the people that you meet in the car space is very similar to sort of the art world, in that people that share the passion for collectible cars, they come from all different types of businesses, from different countries and backgrounds. And so that's a really interesting aspect of the space. As far as collectability and value, I mean, I think it was really the car that we sold at the Mercedes factory a number of years ago, which fetched $150 million, or nearly $150 million, the Mercedes 300 SLR, the Uhlenhaut Coupe, which really, I think, perked up the eyes and ears of the art community, because an automobile had never brought in anywhere in close to that figure before. And so it really kind of put cars on the map as far as, them getting to the point where they are serious collectible objects, and they are something that not only has great appreciation, but are very important historical pieces in the collectible world.
Well, what's the sort of the scale and the sort of Venn diagram between art collectors, which is a $60 billion business, and collectible cars? Because you can't say the whole car business, because that includes Camrys, but whatever you're calling vintage cars and collectible cars. How much of an overlap do you think there is? I mean, very few art collectors I know collect cars, maybe half a dozen that I know of, and probably they lean to Ferrari or something. Maybe that's its own world. And what percentage of your major car clients are collecting art, would you say?
It's difficult to draw figures around that. I don't know that we have any figures, to be honest. I think one of the barriers to car collecting is really the infrastructure that's needed to support car collecting. I mean, I collect artwork and I have a lot of walls, and I can put my art on the walls, and they don't leak oil. They don't require annual services. I don't need a team of people to run them. Cars are living, breathing things. They need to be used. They need to be exercised. They need to be taken out. They need to be shown at concourses and shows to build provenance. They really
cars or horses, it sounds like.
Well, essentially, that's probably where we'll end up, at some type of equestrian car centers. But no, the barrier to entry with cars is probably the one thing that holds the industry back to some degree, because, they do require things. And so if you buy a car, a lot of people don't know, who do you get to service it? Where do you store it? What if it doesn't start? How do I fix it? Versus a painting.
I just wrote last week about the price point that I thought that an emerging work of art should cost. And I said it should be, and it got way beyond it, $15,000. That's like what should be the sort of like first kind of work or early solo show kind of thing. What would you say the entry point for a collectible car, if whatever term you want to use, should be? Is it $100,000? Is there a number that you would sort of say, listen, below that, it's like transportation?
No, I think a collectible car can be a much lower price point than that. So we basically look at the market in sort of two segments. One is more the digital sort of sales business, which we're trying to build, which is really the long tail of the market and the volume side of the market. And those cars range anywhere from sort of 10, 15,000 right on up to about 500,000 to $1 million. And then there's the really sort of the high end portion of the market, which are really the real blue chip sort of collectible cars. Those are cars that have matured in value, that are very few in production numbers, that are typically represented by the big brands and the big makes, Ferrari, Porsche, Mercedes, and so on. And so, that segment of the market is much more sort of niche and tailored, and the broader sort of collectible cars, which are more production level cars, they're still very collectible. And the average prices of some of the newer cars are starting to, to gain in popularity with sort of a demographic shift. But the collector car segment spans pretty wide range as far as, price points.
I remember about 10 years ago, I used to consult for eBay, and the CEO was my personal client, and we tried to sort of get them into the art business. I think that at that time, they were probably the biggest car dealer in America.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of ways that the business has changed over the years. Back in the day, it was really a much more cottage industry in terms of, car collecting wasn't really seen as a thing. You typically just buy cars, use them, take them to sort of local shows, and then events like Pebble Beach and, some vintage racing, was always kind of popular because you got to use your cars. And then you had big players like eBay pop in. But even before eBay, there was a company called Cruise Auctions, which was really contemporary to Barrett Jackson, for those of you that are familiar with the car space. And it was really a Barrett Jackson and Cruise dominated market on the lower end segment of collecting cars here in North America. And Cruise got bought by eBay Motors because eBay Motors was really scaling their business during the tech bubble. And they tried to fuse a live mainstream auction business with their sort of more of a digital product. And it worked for a while, but I think they were just a little bit ahead of their time in a sense. And so it ended up not working and it fizzled out. And I think eBay Motors still has a car motors section, but it's not near the position towards more collectible, high-end collectible cars as it maybe once was. In the meantime, you've had a company called, Bring a Trailer pop up, and they've really sort of dominated the mainstream digital auction space. And they've brought this really great community to it too. And they've created this really interesting kind of way that you can interact with one another, and you can look at all sort of types of different cars. And it's a really, really interesting platform that, we look at carefully and that we pay attention to, and collectors really enjoy.
Have you paid much attention to cars made by artists? And I have one particular one in mind that you might not know about. So do you know that history of beyond the BMW art cars, that artist cars?
I mean, the BMW art cars are by far the most famous, and everybody knows. Warhol's done some work on cars. Keith Haring's done some work on cars. There's a Japanese artist that I really enjoyed.
I remember him. Yeah.
Yeah, Yamagata. He did some Mercedes that were really kind of funky. So, we sold a Porsche. I think it was a 356 that was painted for Janis Joplin. I forget the artist's name. So there's been a number of attempts at sort of art cars, but who are you referring to, Josh?
I'm talking about Chris Burden. Do you know Chris?
No.
So if you go to Lackman, there's a big sculpture of all the lamps, the urbanites in front of. You live in LA. You've seen this.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's a famous performance artist from LA. He had himself shot in the 70s. He crucified himself on a VW bug. He's dead. They showed with Gagosian. And when I was his dealer back in the 80s, I sold a car he made. I think this is probably a big price for like $400,000 in the 80s. And he built a car that was a one-passenger car to go 100 miles an hour at 100 miles a gallon. And he drove it. It was for a project. It was kind of like this bicycle car in a sense. And he got it to 50 miles an hour and 150 miles a gallon. And he built this in the 70s, back when the gas crisis and oil crisis was going on. You should look it up. It's also to a museum in Sweden.
Yeah, I'll definitely look it up. It sounds really interesting.
He also did a piece on cars at the LA County Museum called Metropolis, which has maybe a 5,000 square foot toy car track. You should see it sometime.
Yeah, I will. I'll take a look at it. Our car gallery is right next to Ed Ruche. So he's a neighbor of ours. And Ed has a number of works that kind of are car themed or automotive themed.
I think just Ed moving to LA from Oklahoma and Route 66 and all the Sunset Strip and the parking lots. I mean, I think there's more relations than people might be aware of. It's probably a good coffee table book at some point. Now, the art world is really leaning in to this concept of luxury. Your partners with Sotheby's, they're certainly becoming more of a luxury brand. And I think certainly Christie's is thinking about it on the memorabilia. Do you think that the same concepts work across luxury and art and cars? Are they really completely different markets? It's sort of an open-ended question about what do you hear when you hear luxury?
What do I hear when I hear luxury? I personally don't like the term luxury. I feel like it feels too excluding. And I think that I look at cars as a really welcoming, popular community where everybody's welcome. And I think the term luxury kind of feels too sterile in a sense. And I really think that when you look at the car community is one in which your net worth or how much money you have really doesn't apply necessarily. I think car guys are car people, and people that appreciate automotive design and appreciate cars they're welcome no matter how wealthy they are or how big their car collection is. We get these really interesting Instagram kids that are, 18 years old that come up and they have such passion about cars. And, we get these little kids sometimes that come to our shows and their parents want them to get in cars just so that they can take photos of them. And I think that we really encourage that kind of behavior. And the term luxury to me, it feels too positioned at a certain kind of community. And I think that cars really should be accessible to everybody. And I think that the car space should be one that's really welcoming and should be more about humanity in general and just more about a shared passion versus one that's sort of positioned towards a certain market.
This
I don't
is
know.
really interesting because I think the art world is saying, how do we expand? How do we get bigger? And they sort of said, oh, let's tag it into the luxury world. But the art world is already it's sort of elitist in some places, or feels like it excludes people. So they say, oh, luxury, that's going to open it up to more people. But you're kind of saying that's kind of like a vicious circle because luxury wants to keep people out too. So it may not be really the right way to think about expanding the art audience. If I'm reading your analysis there.
Yeah, like I think that there's this misconception with artwork that it should be positioned towards a luxury clientele and a high net worth clientele. And I feel like that's wrong. I feel like the art world should be for everybody. And I think when you look at artwork back in the, historical times, I think artwork was something that it was a public place for people to really enjoy it. And I think that the expression of museums and galleries should be meant for the public and should be meant for everybody to enjoy. And they should be, they should raise questions around what's happening in society and what we're doing as a human race. And it should raise, questions around what's happening at any given moment. And it should be almost a community square type of feel. And I think that the term luxury to me feels too elitist, like you mentioned. I look at cars and collectible cars as something that should have a mass appeal to everybody. And whether people can afford them or not, the community should embrace everybody with a passion, and those fortunate enough to own them should take them on rallies and should take them out and let communities enjoy them and let little kids jump in the seats and kind of spur that passion, that next generation of collecting. I think that's really important. So from a commercial perspective, I can totally see why, companies like Sotheby's and Christie's and others are sort of trying to position various collecting categories and sort of this luxury component. But I love cars and I feel like cars should be shared with everybody. And I think there should be more efforts made to sort of embrace, the car community and engage more people in the car community. And I feel like that's a really important thing because there's so much interesting things to learn about cars. And I think that everybody could, bring things to the table. Our business was founded as a restoration facility. My dad quit school in grade 10. He has a high school education and not even. And he worked really hard and he learned, specific knowledge around certain cars. And we have a restoration facility to this day. And the kids that we're getting out of the McPherson College in Kansas, they're amazing, amazing, young, talented people.
Great story, Monterey just now about a restoration project that you guys, if I heard correctly, were involved that sort of rebuilt the best in show from one car that had the original chassis and another with the engine, another. There are like three of them were somehow combined. Did I have that restoration story sort of correct in what happened from a couple of years ago to now?
Yeah, so that was a couple of years ago, but there was a car it had lived with two separate owners. So it was separated early on in its life, and it had lived in two separate owners. The chassis was owned by one gentleman, and the body and the engine was with somebody else. And so what we did is we found a particular client that wanted to restore that car to its former glory as one piece. And so the owner bought both cars, and we negotiated a sale with both owners to sell both cars to this one individual, and we reunited the car as it should be, and we restored it. We embarked on a 2.5-year restoration, and we restored it, and we took it to Pebble Beach, which is the Super Bowl. It's the most prestigious award you can win in car collecting. And we took it to Pebble Beach, and it won Best of Show among a very, very tough field.
But there was an interesting story about when you kept talking about restoration of doing that. You can't really imagine that with an artwork, I don't suppose.
No, I mean, there's interesting stories about artwork that's recovered from, these dilapidated houses. It's been discovered for years, and there's this element of restoration. Sotheby's, we did this interesting podcast or video on a small sort of T-Rex dinosaur. I forget the name of it, but it was really interesting to think about the restoration of a 1,000,000-year-old skeleton. I think there's parallels between that world, the archaeological world and the car world. And in a sense, we have a restoration shop with 40 plus artists. Really, they're artists. And we get these people and they come from all places around North America and the world. And then they learn this craft and this tradesmanship. And it's incredible what they can do. You know, we built this car this year, which was built out of mahogany wood. And the guys in our body shop, they had to learn how to work with wood in a different medium. And so they had to source wood with the right ring count and make sure that the wood matched. And they had to apply it in a way that was as it would have been. And they had to work with old world technologies to shape the metal and shape the body. And it was sculpture. It took 2.5 years. And we won Best of Show this year, actually, in Pebble Beach. And so the restoration side of the business is a really interesting one, you know, and I think it's really preserving artifacts that in 300, 400, 500 years, that will be really important, you know, to generations to come. And so that's a really fascinating piece of the business to me. But to my point earlier, I think it really should be shared among everybody. And I think the passion should exist among as many people as possible.
Well, art became so much about the money, I think, at kind of excites some, and certainly I make my living from it, and I'm not as a gatekeeper objecting to it, but it's also a barrier. It's like, with the guys in your shop, would you ever take them, hey, let's take the day off and let's go to the Getty? It's like all these, you know, guys who are building engines and doing the woodwork on these things. Wouldn't that be a good field trip for your guys?
I think it would be an amazing field trip. And I think giving them the perspective of, you know, artwork that was done in periods when the cars were being made, like this particular car was built in 1928 that they restored for Pebble Beach. So to draw parallels to artwork that was being created back then and to have an insight into the minds of the artists that were creating works back then, I think would be really appealing to our team in the shop, you know, and these are guys working with a lot of the materials that artists would have been working with back then. You know, they're working with various types of metals and composites, and they're working with types of paint that would have been painted with that sort of paint back then. And they're shaping things and they're forming things and they're working with technologies and trying to figure out, you know, how things would have been made back then. And there's no schools on that. You just really have to honestly be very intuitive in terms of how you look at historical documents and records and how you want to recreate that. So I think it would be incredible for some of our team to go to some of these major art museums and almost have guided tours and have people explain to them, you know, what was happening back then, because I think they could really draw parallels to it.
I think it'd be great. I think people who make things, and like for sake of argument, more working class, they could be much more interested in art for just that. You know, when I would have the space I ran and the guys from the UPS would come in, because we're in the same building, they'd be like, how's that made? How do you do that? And they were really interested viewers. So, and it's just making me think more and more that as the art world is trying to sort of like, oh, let me get that Ferrari buyer, maybe we're taking the wrong tack. Maybe we need it to be bigger and broader and more open rather than more and more exclusive. But I suppose your high-end car buyer who's spending $25 million on a car sort of wants it looked at like a Rothko too.
I think it's natural from an economics perspective. If you have, you know, if there's 36 Ferrari 250 GTOs and they're a, you know, absurdly beautiful object and the performance is completely mind blowing and they allow you to access certain places and clubs, and it's natural that they're going to be worth 50, 60, 70 million or more. You know, I think that's normal because there's such a demand for such a limited supply. So it's really simple economics at that point. You know, any of the great artists, you know, when you look at Rothko or you look at Picasso, Warhol, Basquiat, any of the modern generation stuff, there's limited supply and there's a great demand based on the achievements that they've contributed and made to the art world and the thought process of what they were thinking during that time, much like cars were. Then it's normal that there's going to be a clamoring of demand for those particular rarefied objects. And so I think it's normal you're going to see prices at such a high level. I think what I would like to see is that the community that collects those pieces don't necessarily look at it as luxury sort of elitist pieces that shouldn't be shared. But I think it's great. Like we did this, again, referring back to this rally we did in Colorado, you know, the car we were driving was $12 million and we were really driving it spiritedly. And the money that we were raising on this rally was being used to support the Colorado State Police, state troopers. And it was to support the small towns in Colorado that were in sort of economic disrepair. And so we would drive these cars into these small towns and we would see a small little hospital built based on the proceeds that we were raising for them. And the community would come out with their kids and their families, and we'd have lunch in their town square, and they would have a local band play for us, and we'd sit at picnic tables, and we'd interact with the community. We'd let a lot of the community members sit in our cars. We'd take them for short drives. Like, I think the idea that the great works of art and great cars should be shared with the public is really, really important because it really is. So that's what they were meant to do and meant to be. These great race cars, you would see these cars racing at the 24-hour Le Mans, like these long endurance races, which are really incredible to think about. You have two drivers racing 24/7, all out in rain, weather, darkness. So the mechanical feats that these cars would achieve, but then the fans, you'd see thousands and thousands and thousands of fans and enthusiasts that would get to see these cars, and much like modern Formula One cars. So I think it's really important to kind of build that community and make sure that it's very, very inclusive to everybody, regardless of what backgrounds people come from and what level of wealth that they have.
Well, as much as, again, we're involved in the art market, I remember when Eric Fischel, a friend of mine, he basically did a museum for the road, and he tried, and he couldn't raise enough money. But I think his intention was really good, and maybe the art world would get out of its malaise a little bit if it didn't look inside so much and said, let's go out there and make it more available to people. And let's meet them. We, as a small media company, are trying to think that way. How do we promote people that way? That's why it was interesting to talk to you, and your take on luxury or not was, I think, really my biggest takeaway from this conversation.
Yeah, like I took my son to school today in a BMW i7 300. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's a three-wheeled micro car that was built by BMW in the 50s, and the whole front opens. And I brought him to school, and my son's 8. And when I got there, like the teachers, in the school line and all the kids from the classrooms, they came out and we had photos around the car, and I taught them about what the car was and what era it was produced. And I let the kids sit in it, and I let the teachers, and it's not a valuable car. It's, $40,000 or something, but so it's not necessarily the value, but I think that was a really interesting moment for kids because they would never get to see those kind of cars. And it's a pretty rare moment for those kids. And I think it's great for the teachers and great for the public to have those kind of cars out. And I try and encourage that as much as I can. And not to say that I think investment potential is a bad thing, because I think that there's amazing investment potential in cars. And I would encourage people to look at cars as a real asset class in that regard. Like, if a 250 GTO is $5 million in 2002 and it's, $70 million today, that's a hell of a return. But I think the primary driver should be the enthusiasm around the cars, and then there should be the investment, secondary.
Well, this has been great. Let's keep up the dialogue. Shelby, thank you so much for being on our podcast. I think there's definitely collaborations that need to happen. They're not quite as obvious. It's not just a brand association. So thank you.
I don't know if you want to see a couple of cars. I have a few cars in my office. I can point my screen towards them.
Yeah, we would love to see that and put it in. And then I can tell you about how I bought a too expensive car in COVID, but I love it.
So I'm looking at a couple really interesting cars. This is a 275 GTBC. It's one of 12 competition cars ever built. It was built in complete aluminum, and it's a magical piece. And the design is from the 60s. This is like one of the short wheelbase California Spiders, which is it's just an incredible car. So it's a unique color, and it's just amazing condition. We have a Ferrari F50 here, which is a little bit more of a contemporary piece. And so that's sort of your 90s Ferrari. And then probably the pinnacle of modern car collecting is that car right there, which is a McLaren F1. And a McLaren F1 is considered the sort of 250 GTO of our generation. And so these cars are here on just storage, but they're really fascinating cars. And that, I don't know if you know the McLaren F1, but it's 3 seats. So it's a center cockpit car. And these were the fastest car in the world for about 20 years till the Veyron came along. And so it's just really an incredible piece of technology, machinery, speed, and design.
Those are super cool. They're great works of design. Whether they're works of art, that's an interesting dialogue, but they're fantastically beautiful.
Yeah. So, well, I appreciate it, Josh. It was fun chatting.
Shout out to Lindsay Christensen for setting this up. She's like the person who knows everybody. So thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Shelby.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. She's a legend. Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Shelby Myers for joining us on the Baer Faxt podcast. And if you like these free podcasts, you might want to check out our new free newsletter, No Reserve, from the Baer Faxt.
Thanks for listening to the Baer Faxt podcast. Our host is Josh Baer. Our audio editor is Auntie Lane. Check back soon for future episodes as we unpack the inner workings of the global art industry through exclusive, candid interviews with key players in the business, as they offer their perspectives on art and the market in the US, Asia, Europe, and beyond.